Hello, I'm Joseph Rescigno, talking about my book, Conducting Opera Where Theater Meets Music. In this video, I'd like to talk about through composition. In opera, that means an entire scene or act or opera performed without breaks for applause or dialogue. It's continual music that goes on without interruption from the beginning to the end of the act or scene. If we go to the earliest operas still in our standard repertoire, we have the works of Claudio Monteverdi. We have La Favola d'Orfeo, we have Il Ritorno d'Ulisse in Patria, and especially the most performed, L'Incoronazione di Poppea. These works, you don't applaud at any time until the end of the act. In fact, the earliest of those, the Orfeo, is mostly something called recitar cantando, acting through singing. And a small group of musicians that accompanies the performers, and it's a complete theatrical experience. Now, from this beginning, in less than 80 years, opera changed very dramatically through a composer like Alessandro Scarlatti, especially with the works, the operatic works of Antonio Vivaldi, because the Venice school was very important in the development of opera in Italy. And finally, the works of George Frederick Handel for Italy. We have, instead of continual singing, not interrupted by applause, we have the emphasis put on the virtuosity and the bravura of each individual singer. We have arias ending very precisely and applauded. So there could be 15, 16 applause moments throughout an entire opera. There was a nod, a little bit, trying to go back to an earlier style of less applause with Gluck, but basically the idea of the singers being paramount and applause for arias and for duets was prevalent throughout Mozart and the bel canto. But even in that case, a composer like Mozart was a little different and adventurous. In his opera Don Giovanni, now most of these works began with an overture, a symphonic piece. And that had a very definite ending, and that got applause too. But in Don Giovanni, he wrote the overture not to end in applause, to flow right into the first act. In fact, he wrote an alternate ending for the overture in case it was used in a symphonic concert. So this is what you hear when it's done in the opera. By the time we are at mid-century and the works of Wagner, he believed in a complete experience. In fact, he considered himself, besides a composer, he was the librettist. He designed the theater. He designed the sets. He was a philosopher. He did it all. And he didn't want this complete experience to be interrupted by applause. In fact, he used the word Gesamtkunstwerk, complete artistic work. So the overtures flow into the opera. The arias, when we have them in some of his operas, they don't have a definite ending where the audience can applaud. They just flow into the next section. Now, this began to influence a little bit everybody. I mean, the most influential composer in symphonic music for the first half of the 19th century was Beethoven. And basically, he influenced symphonic writing for the next 120 years. And Wagner had a huge influence on opera composition. We know that Verdi's final opera, Falstaff, is through composed. There is no place to stop for applause in that opera. But he was beginning to experiment with this even earlier. We usually don't hear it in the house because people expect applause, or sometimes he links two scenes together and there's a change of set and the only thing you can do is stop and wait, sometimes 2 minutes, 3 minutes for that change of set. But if we look at Aida, we see that scene 1, which ends with her aria, Ritorno Vincitor, should flow right into scene 2 by the way he ended it. He ended the scene and the aria not on the tonic, but on the dominant, because that dominant note becomes the tonic of the new scene. This is how it will sound without applause and without stopping. Pietà, pietà del mio soffrir. Now, the same idea of connecting scene 1 to scene 2 happens in the fourth, in the last act. Why do I say this? The tempo indication that he gives for the opening of the second scene is not moderato or allegro moderato. It's lo stesso movimento, the same pulse. That's a very strange way to start a new scene. In addition, it takes the motive that we heard fortissimo in the previous scene at the close and plays it only piano. So this is how it sounds if we don't stop. You hear the connection. Even in her third act aria, maybe the most famous thing in the opera, other than the Triumphal March, O Patria Mia, there is no clear ending. It goes right on. We never hear it like that in the theater, but here's how it would sound just as he wrote it. Mio padre, a te gravi cagion m'adduce Aida. Just flows. In his next to last opera, Otello, it's all through composed. There's no place to stop. The one exception is at the end of Desdemona's Ave Maria, Hail Mary, her prayer, in the last act. But it's much more interesting if we don't stop for applause and hear the spooky, frightening music in the double basses that comes right after the orchestra's ending of the prayer. Ave, Amen. You hear that strange, completely unrelated harmony, the key change. Now, we know that for the most part, the last opera of Puccini is through composed. The only real place you can stop for applause would be maybe after Liu's first aria in Act 1. But the famous In questa reggia and Nessun dorma, it just goes on. There's no place to stop for applause. However, he was experimenting with this idea earlier in Tosca. I think he meant that to be a through composed opera. Why do I say that? Well, to accommodate applause after Visidarte and after the tenor's E lucevano le stelle aria in the last act, certain cuts are made in text and in the orchestra. But played with all the words and all the notes, it doesn't leave room for applause. It just flows. Let me play the ending of Visidarte and the words and text that are cut going into the next section. And we hear this. Perché me ne rimuneri così risolvi mi vuoi supplici ai tuoi piedi. See, it just flows. Same thing at the end of E lucevano le stelle. Let me play it with all of the music that is often cut to accommodate applause. Tanto la vita just flows through. And of course, we know that this occurs in Turandot, in his final opera. All right. Now, in the following video, I am going to talk about accommodating applause, should it happen. In these cases, but also in some others. And the reason sometimes applause, or lack of that, may occur. Thank you so much. I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, to share it with your friends who you think would find it of interest, to leave a comment, or if you like, even a question. Thank you so much.